वेलकम टू न्यू एपिसोड ऑफ द पाकिस्तान एक्सपीरियंस। मुझे लगता है हमने पॉडकास्ट बनाई ही और हमने 2 साल पॉडकास्ट की ही इसी एपिसोड के लिए थी, बिकॉज दिस कंबाइन सॉर्ट ऑफ एवरीथिंग दैट वी वांट टू डू। इफ आई एम लाइक एक परफेक्ट पॉडकास्ट रिप्रेजेंट कर दे कि ये बातें हम करना चाहते हैं, एंड आई एम सो हैप्पी एंड आई एम सो ग्लैड शी सेड यस। फर्स्ट लेट्स डू द इंट्रोडक्शंस। माधवी मेनन, थैंक यू सो मच फॉर कमिंग ऑन।
Thank you so much, Shahzad, and thank you for setting the bar so high पहले से ही.
नहीं, कुछ आप जो सारी बातें करती हैं ना, वही हम करना चाह रहे हैं। decolonialism, the idea of identity being fluid, the idea of कि colonialism हमें कितना बर्बाद किया, ये जो हम चीजें फिक्स समझते हैं, आइडेंटिटी हो, रिलीजियस हेट्रेड हो, हाउ क्रिएटेड दे वर टू रियली गेट इनटू दैट। For people who don't know her, she's written extensively about desire, history of desire, किताबें पढ़े इनकी। She's currently heading the English department at Ashoka University. Is that?
No. I'm just a professor there, but I direct the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality.
मुझे लगता है मैं बुढ़ा हो गया, मेरी मेमोरी अब बिल्कुल खत्म होती जा रही है। So let's get into this already. मैंने आपकी एक बात सुनी थी, मुझे बहुत अच्छी लगी थी कि LGBTQ मूवमेंट है, they keep adding letters, but वो जब एक आइडेंटिटी बनाते हैं, इट्स लाइक जॉन लॉक जिन्होंने प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी इन्वेंट की थी कि ये अब दरवाजा लग गया। The invention of private property is that by this door, by me saying I own this property, I'm necessarily saying you don't have a right to it now. So it's been made exclusive. Whereas maybe a South Asian understanding of identity is a lot more fluid than just making more boxes. So if ये आपका ख्याल ही है जो मैं butcher कर रहा हूँ, so I'm going to let you talk about this.
Not at all. आप बिल्कुल butcher नहीं कर रहे. It's I mean, it's a difficult topic because people are very attached to their identities, and for reasons that are very understandable most of the time. When one is feeling precarious, one assumes that gives oneself a sense of security. When one is feeling one belongs to minorities of various kinds, either state-sanctioned minorities or subaltern minorities within state-sanctioned majorities. One feels that you want to look for people like yourself, and then you start clinging on to this question of identity. So there are some situations in which the attachment to identity perhaps is more understandable than in others. Having said that, my question is not, I don't have any kind of quarrel with this identity or that identity, ki jo bhi, whatever anybody wants to be is absolutely fine by me. What I want us to question is, how did this idea of identity become the most fundamental thing to which we are attached or to which we feel attached, right? So why is it not, for instance, the food that we eat? Or why is it not, for instance, the language that we speak? I mean, as we know, language and food, especially in our part of the world, are such important binding factors, ki wo kyun nahi, rather than this idea of identity, which is either religious or sexual. And so the question then is not what are you, but what basis have you chosen to assert a sense of you-ness in the first place? And so the LGBTQIA movement, plus movement that you mentioned, for me, this entire sort of narrative around LGBTQ is an extremely Anglo-American centric vocabulary, which doesn't make it right or wrong. It just makes it, you just have to sort of locate where it's coming from. And because it is coming from a sort of rather different set of circumstances from what we might have historically inhabited here, it can produce a certain kind of clash. So for instance, there are millions of people in India, and I'm sure in Pakistan too, who might consider themselves attracted to people of the same sex, but who've never even heard of the word gay. Ab unka kya karenge hum, for instance? Do we sort of say, no, this is the language that you all need to learn? Or do we try and put pressure on this language that we have all learned, given the experiences that we have? And so for me, that is what is more interesting, which is, why do we take on this certain kind of language wholesale? Why don't we put pressure on it, and why don't we question it? And certainly in India, you see, and I'm absolutely sure this is the case in Pakistan too, that the language of LGBTQIA plus belongs to a certain kind of metropolitan elite, a certain kind of metropolitan privilege, which again doesn't make it wrong. I think everyone needs languages with which to speak. But it does suggest a certain kind of deracinated cutting off from one's environment. And so for me, what's interesting is that, which is not do away with LGBTQIA, but how can we put pressure on that as the only language through which we can speak?
जो आपको शुरू में लगा था ना मैं प्रेशर सेट कर रहा हूँ मैं खुद भी फील कर रहा हूँ बिकॉज आई फील लाइक अ किड इन अ कैंडी शॉप देयर सो मेनी थ्रेड्स आई वांट टू पुल मुझे डर लग रहा है ये कहते हुए भी बिकॉज यू आर एन एक्सपर्ट ऑन शेक्सपियर बट आई हैव अ मास्टर्स इन थिएटर सो आई डू टीच शेक्सपियर नेशनल एकेडमी ऑफ परफॉर्मिंग आर्ट्स में मैं थिएटर हिस्ट्री भी पढ़ाता हूँ तो आई वांटेड टू शेयर एन एनेक्डोट विद यू सो आई बिलीव यू टॉकिंग अबाउट मकुशो आई एम नॉट श्योर बट मैं पढ़ा रहा था and usually मैं उर्दू में पढ़ाता हूँ because नापा में people come from all over so it's a struggle already translating these concepts or making them understand these things तो one of the students gets up and he's like नहीं sir आप गलत use कर रहे हैं gay I was like what do you mean he's like no you're using the term wrong I'm like what do you mean by that he's like नहीं sir वो तो हो जाता है ना हमने क्या हो जाता है लाइक सर देखें वो कभी गांव में अगर कजन साथ सो रहे हैं चारपाई पे तो वो थोड़ा बहुत तो हो जाता है that doesn't mean you're gay I'm like okay what do you think means gay sir gay तो वो होता है ना शहरों में I'm like क्या होता है like सर वो मतलब फैशन डिजाइनर वगैरह so in his mind that stereotype that you see on TV and media the worst kind of stereotype that's gay men having sex with each other those are things that just happen in the village
yeah and you see again this is a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, you can say this expands our horizon of possibility. Ki you can be a man having sex with another man, but not think of yourself as gay. On the one hand, on the other hand, you can say ki this is a way of denying the possibility of a sexual relationship between two men by saying it doesn't even have a name. Now, I am sort of partial to the idea of not having names. I actually think names are, to go back to your first question, very limiting. Because they sort of say this is what you can do and what you can't do. And I think that the point is actually to be able to be true to the multiplicity that we all are. I mean, the most fundamental truth about ourselves is that we are not single, we are not singular, we are not unique in any way. We are multiple. And the multiples intersect with various other kinds of multiplicities at various points in time.
It's
so,
also,
yes. हाँ बोलिए
go for it. No, go for
it.
नहीं मैं आप बताएं please.
No, I was just saying that I will finish saying what I wanted to say actually because the idea कि gay वो होता है really differentiates me from you and completely drives a wedge into a certain kind of Anglo-American discourse that says all men who have sex with other men are gay. Now that is clearly not the case even in America or the UK. But we like to pretend that a label actually fits. And not just a designer label, any label. But for me, that is the question. Why do we pretend that a label fits when it doesn't?
If you ask a lot of gay men, they will tell you that not all men who have sex with men are gay. I think
exactly.
they confirm. And it's also how your sexuality is fluid after a couple of drinks. I think that also
quite literally.
That also affects. But it's interesting that gender fluidity and the ephemeral nature of gender identity and how it can change is a much easier conversation to broach as opposed to sexual fluidity. I think sexuality, the need to box sexuality, which one would assume would be easier to understand as fluid, is much greater than gender fluidity. Gender fluidity is a lot more accepted than sexuality being fluid, which I find is ironic.
Yeah. I mean, but it's also very understandable. I mean, I don't think that's quite right, that distinction, but I know exactly what you're saying. So the reason why gender fluidity is much, much more accepted in our part of the world is because, I mean, to risk a gross generalization is because we invented it. Our traditions of hijras and kinnars and, however many names we go by in the subcontinent is thousands of years old. So abhi, when, you have this entire sort of transgender discourse, it can, and I keep using America as a reference because, I used to live there. So that's where I learned my stuff. This entire transgender discourse in the US can be so annoying because most of them pretend like they came up with this idea or that before them, no one has ever been or known the concept of transgender in the world. So the reason why I think in the Indian subcontinent, why people have a much easier time accepting gender fluidity is because we have thousands of years of history and lived reality, lived experience. We have all grown up with hijras around us. We have all grown up with stories of this mythological tale or that kind of, sort of folk tale in which people change gender, in which people change sex. The very word hijra, coming from the word hijira, the flight of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina, bestows upon it a certain kind of sanctity. And so the idea of movement, which is why I love that it's named after the Prophet's movement, because it's all about moving from one state to another, and that movement is what becomes important. So we have been much more comfortable historically with that idea of movement that many non-Indic cultures have been. Having said that, I think the comfort with that kind of gendered movement is also a comfort with sexual movement, except we just don't know the word sex or sexuality. And so we don't know that that's actually what we're signing on to. Not always, not necessarily, right? If a woman thinks of herself as a man, that doesn't necessarily mean she's heterosexual and will therefore be attracted to other women. Not in that sense. But that when you change gender, nothing then can be taken for granted about what your desires might be, nor should it be. Frankly, I don't think anything should be taken for granted with anybody, what their desires can be, because it can change all the time. But the power of the hijra community in our parts of the world is precisely that. They illustrate for me the gay slogan in North America, which is don't assume anything. And for me, that is so powerful. And I think actually we do know that it's a change of, or it could be a change of sexuality too. We just don't know the word sexuality, which I think is interesting in its own right.
The interesting part is, I mean, I'm going to just be extremely reductionist here, but when somebody asks you, that's when you're forced to reaffirm whatever identity you believe that you are. So for instance, if I go to a restaurant and they have one bathroom, I'm not thinking which bathroom I will use. But if they have a gents and ladies, that's a reassertion. That's where I have to make a decision. So unless the state is involved, I don't necessarily, and I know this is a very problematic word to say anything is natural, but one would assume nobody is naturally inclined to sign forms and be a part of a certain category. It's only when the state comes in and forces you to choose that category is solidified. So if we even go back to India and the subcontinent, it's the British. And I love your quote that I tried really hard not blaming the British for everything and I failed. And that's what I find as well. The more I research, they're behind everything. So even the hijra thing that you're talking about, and there's also this anecdote कि जो काबा है उसकी चाबी हिजड़ों के पास होती थी. So that's how revered they were.
Exactly.
And it's the Hijra Act introduced by the British that criminalizes. We, though, in fact, revered them.
And so nowadays on the streets of Delhi, when you see members of the Hijra community begging, it is actually heartbreaking because they themselves don't know from the heights from which they have fallen. And so the Criminal Tribes Act was introduced by the British 1872. So it's taken, 160 years, 150 years for it to bring that community down to this. But is inevitably what will happen. And this is, what we are reaping now are the seeds that have been sowed extremely cleverly by the British. As I say later in the book as well, not only by the British, but they certainly moved us in a particular direction that I think is particularly harmful. But Shehzad, just briefly to go back to your bathroom wala example, which I think is absolutely right, this is why bathrooms are such a battleground, both for trans activists and for transphobic people. Because trans activists, quite rightly, like you said, say if it's a gender neutral bathroom, then no one can throw us out, whereas trans people regularly get thrown out of whichever bathroom they have to use. And for that reason, transphobic people are like, no, we have to assert this boundary, and so you have to keep that out. So it's very interesting. If you want to know an establishment sexual politics, you would just look at their bathrooms, not at their kitchen or their front desk or their lobby or anything, but look at their bathrooms.
It's even the same toxic masculinity की जो हम बात करते हैं, that oh, I need to protect my women and children. So मेरी बेटी अगर bathroom जाएगी, she might be assaulted by this trans man who's pretending to be a woman. So it goes back to those same ideas. They don't articulate it in terms of izzat and honor, or some Republicans still might. But हम क्योंकि थोड़ी honor killing at least पाकिस्तान में काफी है. It's in the news a lot more. It's in the news a lot more. But they're articulating that same idea कि ये मेरी माँ बहन है जिनको मैंने protect करना है from this trans man who might be a rapist.
Absolutely. And, this is a classic psychoanalytical idea called projection. And I'm very sort of interested in psychoanalysis, which is that the straight, heterosexual, entitled man will project his aggression onto a body that actually is neither aggressive nor entitled, and pretend that that body is going to do what this person actually wants to do. So it's a sort of classic projection, because we all know heterosexual privileged men tend toward a certain kind of domineering violence to protect the goods that they already have, which include, of course, women. But instead of saying, oh, this is my feeling or my emotion, that emotion or feeling gets projected outward. And then they say, oh, you are trying to rape our wives and daughters, when we all know that the maximum number of rapes take place within the household, categorizable under the category of marital rape, which of course is still not recognized as a crime in India.
Same. It's not recognized.
And in Pakistan, exactly.
It's unfortunate. So in terms of these ideas, it's जो हम state की बात कर रहे हैं, how much would we be better served if the state just doesn't get involved in the biology of what's in between somebody's pants? And it's also this bioessentialism. So even on the trans conversation, a lot of people are much readily accepting of people who've had a gender reconstruction. So if you've had that, they're much more accepting of that. But the idea that somebody might have a penis and feels like a woman, वो compute ही नहीं होता उनके दिमाग में.
This is, Shahzad, it's fascinating that you're bringing this up, because I'm actually just working on a piece on pronouns and why we attach so much importance to pronouns. And one of the people I'm talking about in some detail is Bulle Shah. And Bulle Shah, of course, as we all know, is fabulous. But what happens, it's just, the politics of language is so fascinating, because he writes in Punjabi, and Punjabi, as we know, is a very gendered language, but it doesn't have gendered pronouns. There is no, he, she, you don't distinguish between gender when you're talking with pronouns. And so when he writes about Shah Inayat and his relationship to his peer, there's this wonderful lyric number 5, I think, where he says, Ki you have made me dance with a burqa on my head. Zulekha ki tarah, you've made me dance with a burqa on my head. And Bulla, of course, he uses his name in the last line. And so it's a man writing about wearing a burqa. And he hasn't changed his pronoun because he's wearing a burqa. And it hasn't stopped him from wearing a burqa because he is a man. So that kind of, why can't we do all these things that might not line up neatly with each other, which is what the state would like us to do? That becomes the question that I think a lot of Sufi poetry poses to us. So this pronoun thing of I am attached to a he or I am attached to a she also is self-limiting. And so this is the irony of a certain kind of activism, which, I admire activists greatly, but often they sacrifice the nuance of this kind of thinking. What we are demanding might actually be yet another kind of jail for ourselves. And how is it that we might actually militate against going to jail at all and actually come up with a certain notion of freedom? So the classic example, of course, in India, again, following in the footsteps of the US, is this entire idea of gay marriage. Aapko to pata hi hai, in the US, once, the idea of decriminalizing homosexuality, the idea of allowing, overriding the state's sanctions against homosexuality, the first demand made by the LGBTQIA community was for gay marriage, which was also allowed. Now, here in India, 2018, the Supreme Court finally reads down Section 377, which all of us have been suffering under for so long. And now the demand for gay marriage is gaining traction. And I am very opposed, not just to gay marriage, but to marriage of any kind. Like, any marriage I think is bad, because I don't think the state should tell me who I can live with or who I should desire or who I should have sex with. But more importantly, the state should not tie my civil rights to who I have sex with. So my right to inherit property, my right to appoint an heir, my right to rent a house, my right to make a will, my right to medical attention, none of these should be tied to marriage. But the reason why people want rights to marriage is because the state has added this entire bag to it. Everyone wants those rights. Of course, we should all have those rights, but they should not be tied to marriage. And so again, here's a case of saying activists who say gay marriage are not critiquing marriage. They want the rights. But my question is, why not ask for the absolute uncoupling of rights and marriage? Then if you want to go ahead and get married, kar lo bhai, shadi pe everyone has fun, no problem. But don't tie rights to marriage, because that is extremely and utterly discriminatory.
मैंने तीन बातें करनी है इस पर, but if I may just go back to Bulle Shah, if I'm not mistaken, in the same prose, doesn't he say कंजरी बन के यार मनावन दें? So the imagery that is still being evoked is of a conjury. He doesn't say conjure. So he still has that realization, and much like what's in the name, would Romeo still be Romeo? Were he not Romeo called? Bulle Shah also says कि बुल्ला की जाना मैं कौन. It's quite that similar idea that नाम से होता क्या है. Would a rose still smell as sweet were it not a rose called? तो वो नाम जो है उससे कोई फर्क तो नहीं पड़ता. Doff thy name Romeo. So बुल्ला भी तो वही कहता है कि doff thy name बुल्ला. इस नाम से तुम्हारा क्या होता है? So the imagery is still conjury. He's not saying कंजर बन के यार मनावन दे. So he's quite fine with. He's not taking that as an insult. In our country, तो हमारे पार्लियामेंट में लोग अगर एक दूसरे को औरत बोलते हैं, हमारे एक पॉलिटिशियन है बिलावल भुट्टो, उनको साहिबा बोला जाए, so प्राइम मिनिस्टर इमरान खान called him a साहिबा. That was like an insult. कि वाह, what an insult. Whereas Bulla is quite comfortable with being like, हाँ मैं कंजरी हूँ.
In fact, we have centuries, to go back to what I was saying earlier, centuries of history. Entire generations of Sufi poets or Bhakti poets, the tradition was that the poet becomes a woman in his devotion to religion, peer, aesthetics, ethics, politics, jo bhi hai, that you become a woman, which is problematic because that means that the idea of a devotee is always the idea of a woman. Yeah. But it's interesting because almost all these poets are men. So this idea of being comfortable enough to know that I really don't mind, and my pronoun does not limit me, and I can be much more expansive than my limitation, I just find fascinating. And as I said, we all have that muscle memory, even though we have for a few centuries now being pushed out of it or nudged out of it, we all have a certain kind of historical civilizational memory of that. And that might see us through a few more years, let's hope at least. Uske baad to pata nahi kya hoga.
And I think some great content is being made, but I really think somebody should make a movie on Madhulal Hussain. It has everything that we should have been. A Sufi saint, a Hindu boy. Let's put aside age and consent wala discussion to the side, but love and the sanitization of Sufi saints and Sufi poetry and the suppression of homoeroticism. I think the defense presented is, there is no evidence that Rumi and Shams were having sex. You don't need evidence. They still love each other in a certain way. Shah Inayat and Bulle Shah love each other in a certain way. It's not necessary that they need to have sex. I think we necessarily sometimes associate, and you've also talked about films like Sholay and Anand, where the male friendship.
Yeah.
Why do we fall short of calling it love just because the assumption is these two men didn't have sex?
And with people like Nizamuddin Aulia and Amir Khusro and people like that. I mean, I've written this thing on dargahs. The very fact that, they are buried together side by side, which is, of course, now the heterosexual fantasy, right? And that's the Romeo and Juliet fantasy, since you've been bringing that up, which is the man and the woman will be together forever. And here are these two men in dargah after dargah after dargah. You see the Peer and Shagird buried side by side. There is a certain intensity in that relationship that, as I said, we are not used to calling it sexuality. And because sexuality still seems like a foreign word, we automatically assume that it is bad, or that it has to be based in some kind of, as you said, biological expression. And none of that was true for any of these people.
You've also written about Kamali and Jamali, and you had a very interesting anecdote about the pen and the paper.
So that is anecdote come and just sort of, what I observed, because when I went to Jamali Kamali's tomb, and the peer there is Jamali. And Kamali, if you ask anybody ki Kamali kaun the, they'll say, as I said, I got different answers. Some people said ki, unke disciple the. Some people say unki biwi thi. Some people say unka beta tha, unke dost the. And dost, of course, as we know, even today, is such a so heavily drenched in what we would call sexual connotations, which is what makes it a fabulous word. I love the word dost. And so no one is clear what that relationship is, but everyone knows that they were so close that they had to be buried together side by side. And what's interesting about that, and the reason it is two men together, is because kabron ke upar, the surface of the kabar in these dargahs tells you whether it's a man or a woman. And so if it is a flat surface, it is a woman. And if it is a sort of, protruding surface, that is supposed to symbolize the pens with which the peer writes, that is the male grave. So very clearly inside Jamali Kamali's tomb, you can see that these are the graves of two men lying next to each other, with all their other people lying in the courtyard outside. So this is our old romantic idea, right? Janam Janam ka saath. I mean, where would Bollywood be without it? This idea ki we will never be separated.
Jaan se bhi lenge tere liye. It's so interesting. हमने history में दोस्त zone कर दिया. हमारे सूफी saints तक को हम friend zone करके बैठे.
Exactly. Friends with benefits.
It's also projection, what you want to believe. नहीं वो भाई होंगे. You don't want to accept anything else. So you're like, नहीं ऐसे थोड़ी होता. बेटा होगा.
Right.
If we go back to 377, you also talk about how, yes, it's a victory, and everybody who feels great about it, that's great. But there's also a problem with that articulation, because again, the idea of carnal sex or sex against nature is much greater. It's been used disproportionately against gay people because of rampant homophobia. But maybe the argument against it needs to be much greater than rather coming from just a singular community or making it about just gay sex.
You see, this is the dilemma we are in the middle of every single day of our lives, especially in the subcontinent, which is the majoritarian narrative has taken such a stranglehold on us that we can't even imagine an outside to that narrative. So what we're all stuck doing is fighting our battles within that narrative. But if we fight battles within that narrative, we are never going to get anywhere, because we're not allowing any oxygen in. So if the narrative is going to be, this is about gay people, then the solution is, so please free gay people. Because that is the narrative that has been generated. 377 is about gay people. You see, what's fascinating about 377 is, of course, it was first promulgated in India, in the Indian subcontinent, and then exported to all the other British colonies around the world. A year after it was introduced in the Indian subcontinent, they actually added a gender specificity that our version of 377 doesn't have. So by the time it got to Singapore, it was man to man, and that had been specified. So here, to my mind, we had this golden opportunity to say, all that 377 says here is it prohibits carnal acts against the order of nature. Now, do we all have the strength and bravery and courage to say every single one of us performs carnal acts against the order of nature? Ab kin ko aap arrest karenge?
I'm not sure. It's been a tough time. Some of us have been isolated alone.
2018 wali baat kar rahi hu.
Some of us were still single pre-COVID. Yahan Tinder banned.
Also, but that all one can certainly, in a single state,
Haan.
as you know, perform carnal acts against the
I
order
know.
of
I've
nature.
Googled Merlin Manson. I know what's possible.
So the sense of can we speak a different language? Might that be a more effective way of changing the narrative? Because for me, what is most frightening these days is that people are insufficiently challenging majoritarian narratives. And unless we do that, we're not going to get very far out of it.
It's just the state is in the business of restricting rights, and everybody's like, okay, include us too, rather than
Yeah,
them saying, let's break this cycle altogether. Just expand the circle, not that let's get rid of the boundaries. If I may draw a parallel, the suffragette
yeah,
movement originally,
yeah,
they weren't arguing for rights for all. They were arguing for rights for women, but they were still racism. They said, oh, we're better than these black people. So if you're
yeah,
going to give them rights, give them to us first because we are white women.
yeah.
It's that same idea. We're still stuck in that. हमें भी तो जैसे अक्षय कुमार की एक मीम है कि मेरे को भी तो अंदर लो नॉट के ये दरवाजा ही तोड़ दो अंदर हो ही
Exactly.
ना.
Exactly. That's the whole point, which is that every plea for inclusion on behalf of a specific identity or community is always a plea for the exclusion of another community or identity. Those two go hand in hand. There is no one without the other. And so rather than saying I'm seeking inclusion on the basis of a communitarian identity or an identitarian community, if you say, and this is why my example of marriage, if you say, let's uncouple rights from this particular state of being, then suddenly you'll find people are actually not that attached to that state of being. But because you have freighted that state of being, you have loaded it with so many goodies, with so many state sanctioned goodies, फिर सब बोलते हैं हमें भी चाहिए, हमें भी चाहिए. So immigration is a classic case. This is the big problem with the US, for instance, right? Everyone wants marriage rights in the US because your immigration status depends on that. And if you separate immigration from marriage, then what is going to happen is a question that no one asks.
Do you find it difficult to have this conversation where people might retort with, oh, I'm a gay man, this is why this is important to me? How do we be in both those boats together? I get that this is important for you and I will fight for your right to have this right if you want it, but at the same time we need to articulate it in a different way.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in several conversations with lawyers. Many of them are, many of the people who fought the 377 case are my friends. I've spoken to them a lot about it. I think the fundamental assumption in all these conversations has to be trust, that there is no shred of homophobia present anywhere. The minute you have that trust, you are automatically opening yourself up to multiple points of view. If the minute an opinion disagrees with yours and you point a finger at it and say X phobia, whatever it is, homophobia, misogyny, transphobia, racism, jo bhi, the minute you say that, that's when conversation shuts down. But the minute you assume that this opinion is not coming from a space of homophobia, or conversely of stupidity, if you respect the people you're talking to, for me, that is fundamental. If you don't have that fundamental trust and respect, you can't actually have a conversation.
I'm sure you face this, but how frustrating it is that if you're criticizing identity politics and people might seek to assume or invoke your identity as, how are you saying this being whatever they assume you are?
Yeah. Oh, many, many times. I mean, all the time. And all I can say to them is, don't assume anything. But of course they will, which is why I sort of have a problem with this entire language of cis and trans. For many reasons. I'll just talk briefly about two of them. One, of course, because cis and trans reimagines a binary, even though the trans politics is about getting rid of binaries. So I think it's sort of very counterintuitive to say, acha, we'll get rid of male, female, but we'll come up with cis trans as a binary. And I think that is a bit avoidable. But the second reason I don't like cis and trans is because the assumption is that so-called cis people are absolutely consistent and uniform, that their identity and self-identity lines up exactly with what the doctors have told them, lines up exactly with what the state has told them. Now, I don't know about you, Shehzad, but I frankly don't know of a single human being who fits that bill. I don't know of a single human being who will act like a woman from day one to day Z, or a man who will act like a man, whatever that is, from a birth to death. Now, wouldn't it be more empowering for us to say that these categories are at best placeholders that are constantly shifting, because we might feel differently at different moments in our lives? So rather than saying, oh, now you're cis and now you're trans, can't we imagine a world in which the categories of cis and trans are not necessary? Because in some ways, we are all, and I want, this again goes back to the 377 argument, we are all transitioning in and out of states all the time. And again, this goes back to the first question I asked: why do we like to pretend that we're not? Why do we like to believe that we are only one thing at any one time when experientially none of us is? वो मुझे समझ नहीं आता कि what is that attachment?
This silence is the sound of you getting cancelled online after. But what if trans people respond with, you are whitewashing my identity? So for instance, I said something like, everybody is bi. If we didn't have these ideas of who I should be attracted to. So for instance, there's an anthropology work done on the Aikung tribe. I think the I is said like, and they, after a certain age, they just send all the children or well teenagers into this hut, and they just discover and they feel whatever. If you don't tell people that this is what you're supposed to be attracted to,
yeah,
you're not, if you don't create a normal, there won't be an abnormal. But when I said that, somebody was like, this is bi erasure. When you say everybody is bi, you're denying that bisexual identity. And if people hold that close to them, you're denying that. So it's part of bi erasure. So if somebody retorts with what you're saying, with what you, by saying everybody is trans, it's the erasure of that trans identity that some people feel is very close to their heart.
This ties in, Shehzad, with so many of the things we've been talking about, right? When we started talking about, for instance, your students saying, मैं तो गे नहीं हूँ, गे तो वो cities में करते हैं, designer वाले लोग. What does a label do for me, do to me? And people assume, and I think erroneously, that labels do more for us than to us. And I think they do more to us. They do a real number on us than they do for us, right? Mm-hmm. So first of all, you're in good company, because the other famous person who talked about bisexuality, or actually polymorphous perversity was his phrase, where he said the whole world is in the grip of that, is Sigmund Freud. The sort of first founder of psychoanalysis. I
saw a great meme which said, we really need to find out how hot was Freud's mom.
So the idea is, we are attached to an identity because we think that is who we are. The question is not be attached or don't be attached. I don't think anyone has the right to question anybody's attachments. I don't care to tell anybody who they should feel attracted to or what they should feel attached as. We all have our attachments, and many of them irrational. So I'm not in the business of doing that. I'm in the business, because I am a professor and an academic and a scholar, I'm in the business of always asking why, what, where, when. And so if someone says to me, I'm very attached to my trans identity, and you're erasing that by saying everyone is trans, first of all, what you're saying is that I want my identity to always be marginal, which actually goes against the express trans politics of saying we don't want to be marginalized, on the one hand. On the other hand, if you're saying that if everyone is trans, then who am I? Then that is a sort of slightly separate question from saying transphobia or trans erasure, because the question more becomes then, if I can't uniquely lay claim to this label, then who am I? And someone like Michel Foucault, as you know, very early on and very clearly, and this is a very hard-hitting sentence of his, he says, visibility is a trap. For him, identity, visibility are all only state-sanctioned categories. And if we want to have any shot of evading those categories, we have to accept what Freud would call polymorphous perversity. Now, a lot of people, most of the world is in the business, as you said at the very beginning, of wanting to carve out that niche for themselves within the state-sanctioned category. So if that's what people want to do, then go for it. That's not what I want to do. And there has to be space and room for both these positions without an assumption of bad faith on either side. And that's what I think, that's why I think we need more and more conversations. This entire, what you mentioned, the sort of cancel culture, and to me, it's so deeply disturbing because it's so deeply unpolitical. It's so deeply unintellectual. It does not engage with otherness. It does not engage with difference. It wants everything to sound exactly like I want it to sound. And for me, that's actually very frightening.
Another interesting anecdote. So I think I've been guilty in the past of giving a lot of reference to identity politics. And I'm friends with a lot of people in different communities. So we're sitting there and somebody from a certain community said कि इस इंसान को तो खुद भी नहीं पता, पहले ये कहता था कि मैं गे हूँ, अब ये कहता है मैं ट्रांस हूँ, कभी इसका प्रोनाउन ही होता है, कभी दे हो जाते हैं, कभी शी हो जाते हैं, इसको तो खुद भी नहीं पता. And I was like, हाँ यार, इसको तो खुद भी नहीं पता. But now when I think back to that story, तो ठीक है, इसमें मसला क्या था अगर उसको खुद भी नहीं पता, and that person keeps changing what they think they are, or are still trying to find themselves and are on a journey. Why should that be even criticized from the community itself?
मसला ये है शहजाद मियां कि if someone else is saying that they are not sure, what happens to my fixity? मेरा क्या होगा? Right? It's like, for instance, you go to a party and you meet a smoker or someone who's drinking alcohol and you say, I don't drink. That person takes it as a judgment against themselves. Yeah. And so if anybody...
I'm that guy. If people at my party don't drink, even though Pakistan mein haram hai, koi bhi nahi pita, but मैं कोक की बात कह रहा हूँ, so I ensure सब Coca-Cola पिए.
But if you are not fixed, then that throws my fixity into question. And that is the masla that you're talking about. That is what creates all this phobia in the world, with people completely uncomfortable with their own fluidity and their need to believe in a certain kind of fixity. And then because they have been pushing down their own, repressing their own fluidity all their lives, when they see someone else not repressing it, the immediate reaction is anger. I mean, it's just fascinating actually to think about this psychically. The immediate response is violence. And so, you know, a lot of trans people, a lot of queer people have been at the receiving end of incredible and very real violence precisely for this reason. No one can stand to see something or someone different from the norm. Now, people like us should not repeat that violence by saying, this is my norm and I cannot bear to see you depart from that. That is going to be a sort of doubling of the violence rather than charting a different course altogether.
That's interesting because I always assumed that a lot of violence against trans people is committed because of access, because police उनकी FIR नहीं काटता, उनके पास कोई rights नहीं होते. But this idea that a man looks at a trans person and hates something within themselves, something they've repressed, and see the other person expressing it and how that comes in anger, that's also a very, very interesting point. If we are talking about psychoanalysis, sorry.
No, I was saying they're both true. The fact that police FIR nahi bharenge is as true as the psychic turmoil that queer people, trans people throw. I mean, it's, you know, the phrase is moral panic, right? The idea that, oh my God, we are all going to die because someone is not adhering to the category of man or someone is not adhering to the category of woman. It's all about the person who's feeling the panic, not about the person who's not adhering.
सही कहते हैं ना कि homophobia is just homoerotic feelings. If you hate gay people, you're probably gay because you hate something within yourself. अगर viscerally आपको इतनी नफरत है, तो आप खुद अपने अंदर ही शायद कुछ suppress करें. But if I may talk about society and psychoanalysis, you feel like as a society we're also overvaluing victimhood. Actual victimhood needs all of our support, but it's come to a point where Rachel Dolezal also exists, that because there's a value placed in terms of social capital in being a victim and being Black, and you've not experienced or you've not lived the life of being Black, but you pretend to be Black just to get that social capital of victimhood.
I have very mixed feelings about this, Shehzad. And I am saying that quite genuinely because I don't know what I think about it. And I actually like that position, which is, for instance, that you said earlier, ki gender seems easier to cross than sexuality. Both seem easier to cross than race. And especially in the US. And so what would it mean, for instance, for a non-Black person to say, I feel Black? Now, a lot, if we draw a parallel with transphobic discourse, a lot of women say a man cannot be a woman or become a woman because he has not grown up with the material circumstances of being insulted and demeaned and what it means to be a woman all their lives.
Primarily J.K. Rowling.
And many like her, don't worry. There are plenty of transphobic people around the world. Exactly. Now, the problem with that kind of position, again, is that it assumes that all women go through one set of experiences. Agar wo wala experience aapko nahi hua, then you are not a woman. Now, clearly, you can see the stupidity of that position. Why can we not extend that critique to race? Now, as I said, I am genuinely not sure what I feel about that. But for me, I have flagged it as a problem that certain lines seem easier to cross than certain other lines. Turks or whoever it is, some feminists will say that M to F transitioning is more widely accepted because it's at the expense of women. Whereas racial passing is not accepted because a lot of, white people are sort of up in arms about that. What I'm interested in, especially in M to F transitioning and in white to non-white transitioning, even though that's not a thing, is that these people are actually giving up access to power and privilege to inhabit a position that gives them neither. Men who decide that they want to live their lives as women are giving up a certain kind of patriarchal purchase, which they did not have to. And for me, that makes that decision so much more worthy of admiration and respect. Similarly, which white person, aap bataye mujhe Shehzad, which white person would voluntarily say, I am not white? Unless there is something there, what that something might be, is it worthy of my respect? I think it is, but I'm not sure what it is. And so for me, it's just interesting to think about which lines get policed to what extent.
I'll be honest, I'm not in a place where I'm ready to accept trans-racial switches. And if I may push back a little on what is to be gained, a lot of people who are invoking it are invoking it for some social capitals. For instance, Rachel Dolezal became the head of a Black organization. Elizabeth Warren thinks she's going to get a lot of votes from it. So she invokes this Native American identity that Trump calls us Pocahontas for. And a lot of people in their college essays invoke this identity of being Native American because whites feel a little threatened that they're being targeted or they're being blamed. Either that comes out in tacky torches, or it comes off of, oh, these are the bad people. I'm not one of them. I'm actually a victim too, because I am 1/16th Native American.
Yeah. You see, I agree with you completely that I am not a great supporter of people who want to jump onto the bandwagon of something because it is fashionable or you'll get some gain from it. I'm not even talking about that. But also, Shehzad, I want to say that this idea that someone is doing something in order to gain from it is a very old narrative. And it's something
I realize I sound exactly like the anti-trans movement a decade ago.
Not just that, but also anti-feminist, misogynistic, everybody. It's like, What are these women trying to do? They're trying to take things away from us. And so there are no doubt there are cases in which that is true. But I'm a little hesitant to use that as my primary prism, which is to say, I don't want criminality to be my primary prism through which I look at ideas of change and movement and transition. Because if I did that, then I would be absolutely no different from the phobic people I'm criticizing. So yes and no at the same time.
I know it's definitely a very interesting thing to think about, and I wonder where we will be. There's also, and now this person was seen as a joke, but somebody also said, this old guy, that I feel 16, so I want my legal age to be changed 16. Would you be open to something like that as well?
You see, this is what I'm saying. First of all, it's not up to me to be open to anything, but it is
as a talking point.
It is so true. If you talk to anybody above a certain age, it tends to happen with older people. They say, I don't feel anything more than 22. But of course, in our countries, if you have a government job, bhai, retirement age to ye hai. Age of consent sexually, ye hai. And, a lot of people have written against this. You see, it's always the assumption of uniformity. Now, I understand that there is administrative convenience to it. I do understand that. I'm sort of a great fan of efficiency, and I understand that. But it's a different thing to say this is an administrative, efficient code, and a different thing to say this is who you are. You see, and we have to be able to separate those narratives. So it doesn't, if someone might be 40 and unable to work, should they be given, of course, I think there should be state safety net. We should all be living in socialist milieus in which you don't fall without a net underneath you. But someone might be 70 and still have a very sharp mind, and to put them, against their will out of a job is cruel. So these things they require more thought, is all I'm saying. I don't have the answers to them, but I think they require more thought.
I think it's the same idea, right? Inko bhi benefits chahiye, inko bhi benefits chahiye. Maybe if you have a universal basic income and everybody's getting benefits, then we stop fighting at the margins, ki mujhe bhi do, and everybody has it.
No, but this is the whole thing, right? This is how states function. He's saying it is a fixed pie. And so if I give one crumb there, then that's one crumb less for you, which is not the way in which economies or societies work, but that's what we all believe.
Since you've already mentioned consent as well, you have really, really interesting thoughts about that as well. कि होना और ना होना दोनों साथ किस तरह से exist कर सकते हैं. It's also a fallacy to assume that if somebody says that I've consented, वो 100% consent. And just to frame this is not a conversation for people who violate consent. Absolutely not. If you knowingly violate consent, you're a criminal, you're an assaulter, and it's clear in a lot of situations that there is not consent. But in certain situations, you also talk about the fluidity of consent. कि यार करना भी है, but नहीं भी करना. Society भी कहती है नहीं करना है, but मेरे अंदर एक desire भी है जो मुझे society ने बोला है ये बुरी चीज है. तो वो भी साथ साथ play कर रही है. So yeah, what are your thoughts on the fluidity of the idea of consent as well?
I mean, again, as you quite rightly said, Shehzad, consent is a very tricky topic. It's a touchy topic. I'm really glad more and more people are having conversations about this, because I think one does need to. But as I keep saying, whenever I'm talking about consent, it is not a transparent subject, because if it was, we wouldn't be having difficulty with it. The reason why we all have to talk about it more and more is because it is a very tricky and thorny subject. And because, as I've already said, I'm deeply interested in psychoanalysis and deeply interested in psychic formations, which, sex and sexuality are. I'm interested in how we all have what Freud termed an unconscious, which is to say we might act in ways that we don't feel. We might feel things that we don't necessarily act on. And sex has become such a flashpoint for that clash between the conscious and the unconscious. To my mind, that's what makes it so fascinating. On the one hand, we think sex is the most private part of ourselves. On the other hand, we all know that it is the most publicly sanctioned and publicly administered part of ourselves. So this clash between what we might call public and private, or conscious and unconscious, or collective and individual, these are clashes that are at the heart of sexuality. at the heart of desire. And we cannot pretend those clashes don't exist. They exist within each of us, they exist between people as well. Now, you very rightly said that, of course, there are situations of violence, situation of rape, situations that, you know, we can all tell is beyond the pale. Those are not the situations we are discussing. We are discussing situations in which, and I'm actually much more interested in what the person feels who feels, hey, did I give consent or did I not? And I think even asking yourself that is actually exercising a certain kind of agency. You may not have wanted to do what you did, but I think this entire narrative around consent is getting dangerously tied up with a certain neoliberal language of success. Ki if a sexual encounter fails or doesn't work, or if a relationship doesn't work, that doesn't automatically translate into a failure for me. But I feel consent has become this thing that has piggybacked on, bhai, if it hasn't worked, then it means something wrong with the situation and someone needs to be blamed. Whereas if we're able to think about bad sex, bad relationships as part of a certain kind of experiential education that we all, frankly, especially in our neck of the woods, need desperately, would we think differently? Would we be less harsh on ourselves in relation to knowing or not knowing our minds? So that for me is what is interesting about consent. Ki bhai, often we don't know, and that's okay. That's okay. You see, this is the whole thing. For instance, you take the narrative around rape. Both in India and Pakistan, the narrative about rape is that if a woman is raped, that's the end of her life. Famously, our former foreign minister said, ऐसी औरतें तो जिंदा लाशें होती हैं. And I have always chafed against that narrative because, like, how the hell does this mean the woman is to blame for anything? Or why the hell does any of this negativity attach to the woman? It should be the worst thing that a man can ever do. But that's never our narrative, right? So I'm interested in how women think about ourselves. And in all these conversations, whether it's about rape or it's about consent, there seems to be a certain self-loathing, which I think we need to work on. And in terms of consent, you know, you may not have wanted to and then you did it, but don't hate yourself so much for it. It's fine. If there was none of the kind of violence that we already have bracketed out, ratchet it up to experience and move on. And so for me, there needs to be a certain acceptance of human frailty in relation to consent, not somebody else's, but one's own. And I think that is very much missing, which also means we're less empathetic with ourselves, we're less kind to ourselves, which automatically also makes us more aggressive to others.
I think it's also the overvaluing of sex in general. It's the flip side of the same argument. If your life ends, then if you've been in a bad relationship and let's say you had sex, you already have that internalized trauma or society's understanding of where do you stand now. Oh, I was in a relationship which I thought would end in marriage and I ended up having sex with him. Now I'm useless. Other people will think I'm not a virgin. That idea of that social construct almost of, well, Foucault would even say sex is a social construct, but virginity for sure is a social construct.
Yeah.
It's overvaluing of that. And I think maybe there is some overuse of repression as well, whereas people assume everything was repressed, that no, actually you had not given consent, even though you as an adult had given consent.
Right, exactly. And I think if we understand that we all have an unconscious, that we all have conflicts within ourselves, you see, this goes back, I feel like I'm repeating myself, sorry, Shehzad, but this goes back to when I was saying earlier, why should the onus of being unfixed fall on trans people? Why should the burden of being non-normative fall on gay people? What happens if we all recognize the fluidity in ourselves? What happens if we recognize the multiplicity in ourselves? And that for me is the absolute missing part of the conversation.
Something that irks me online is, can we normalize this? No, normalize nothing. Just the idea that the normal should exist. Just
Exactly.
defeat that idea rather than trying to normalize everything, weirdize everything, make everything weird.
Exactly.
Everything that you do.
I like weird eyes. I
Yeah,
think
let's weird.
t-shirt to banana hai aise, weird eyes everything. I like that.
Freshman Ashoka University का जो बैच आएगा ना, it's like Austin की tagline है ना, keep Austin weird. So I think
Yes.
similar to that. इसमें
Yeah.
एक और dicey चीज ये भी है, that you also have thoughts on this social construct of the age of consent.
Yes, definitely. Not because, I mean, because it is. We all know this. We all have grandparents, even great grandparents or great, pardadis, or definitely many of us, even grandparents, who were sort of, married when they were much younger than 18. And the assumption was, as you know, in our part of the world, that the minute you attain puberty, the understanding was that you could have sex. And so the grand battle in parts of India, especially Bengal, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is how to raise the age of marriage for women from 7 to 10. Now, so clearly, we have to acknowledge that this is our history. So suddenly saying anybody having sex or anybody getting married below the age of 18 is a criminal, which you are, is a bit absurd. And, if you've heard of course, you've heard of Alfred Kinsey, the sort of pioneering sexologist in the US. He writes his entire thing. He says we are actually, the teenage years are the most sexually active years. And those are the years that we have chosen to completely repress sexuality. He said the kinds of social evils you're giving rise to by doing this are unfathomable. And, I sort of tend to agree with him. You can't suddenly say, you turned 18, now you go ahead and have sex. The state is not going to sanction you. Now, this is not to say it should be without anybody's say so, without anybody's consent. This entire tradition of forced marriages in India and Pakistan, I think, is really violative and violent. But to be smug and say we are so much more advanced than our ancestors is to be a little historically blind and a little too sort of, pleased with oneself in a fake manner. So, people have had sex long before they're 18.
Yeah, but they can have sex with each other. Like, my position is that if you're an adult, a person below 18 can't give consent to you because there's also power dynamics.
I see. That was your question. Keep someone over 18 and
आपस में तो जो करना है करें.
Yes and no. I am, as I realize that that's my answer to a lot of your questions. I, for instance, am one of those people who are horrified by, 75-year-old straight men marrying 23-year-old nubile nymphets as their wives. And it's like, there is no way this woman actually finds you attractive. There is absolutely no way. But I am being very narrow when I say that, because, for instance, the Monica Lewinskys of the world, or the Mrs. Donald Trumps of the world, are clearly attracted to money, power, position, and I am not invested in judging them for that. So I am not entirely sure that when we use the phrase power dynamic, that it is a fixed term. That, in fact, I don't think people below 18 don't have power. I completely don't agree with that. I think everyone has different kinds of power. Power is very locational, very situational, very sort of conversational, which is to say it always exists in relation to someone or something else. I might have power in terms of class. The person might have power in terms of gender. So if I am trying to seduce, let's say, a man below 18, how do we describe the power differential between us? So for me, that phrase power differential is not transparent. And there is also, and again, this is a sort of psychoanalytical perspective, difference in power can be very sexy, can be very, very erotically stimulating. But again, we try and sound like such prim prudes that we say, oh, gee, power differential, so that's a bad relationship. And I guess I'm just not that invested in judging. If the person below 18 wants to have sex with the 45-year-old person, for whatever reason, as long as there's no physical violence involved, I want to respect that decision.
I am a little torn about this because you're right. I think from an academic standpoint, we can see that power cannot always be transparent, but in practicality, a lot of these cases come from schools. We know about priests, we know about madrase. तो ये जो आर्ग्यूमेंट है कि जी एज ऑफ कंसेंट हमेशा से तो 18 नहीं थी has been misused a lot. Listen, पाकिस्तान में भी forced conversions is an issue where सिंध में मियां मिट्ठू एक बड़े famous politician है. They find underage girls, forcibly convert them from Hinduism to Islam, and then they marry them. We can clearly see what's happening. And they use similar lines of arguments. So sometimes when academic arguments are bastardized for the benefit of one man,
Sure. Yeah.
It becomes a little problematic.
Yeah, no doubt, without any doubt. Absolutely. That's absolutely right. I'm not talking about those cases now, where it's very clear there's sort of criminal activity involved. It's very clear there's sort of one man's ego involved. I'm not talking about those cases. I'm talking very genuinely about, for instance, I mean, I don't want to go back to Romeo and Juliet as an example because you'll say they are the same age, and that's absolutely right. But
13.
Yes. Yeah. But the difference in age is a sort of the reason I also don't like it is because it's often been used as a homophobic accusation, right? Ki gay men are pederasts, all of them, that they want to have sex with younger men, younger boys. A huge trope, as you know, in Sufi poetry is about the beardless boy, the boy who has not sprouted any hair yet, this, that, and the other. And so for me, this notion of below 18, if you are having sexual thoughts about anybody, then that automatically makes you a pederast. For me, and again, I've written about this quite openly, for me, there is nothing more pederastic than heterosexuality, because there is only a heterosexual narrative in which the woman always has to be younger than the man, shorter than the man, earn less well than the man, and be called baby by the man. Has to be hairless, preferably all over, and has to, of course, not have a mind or will or opinion of her own. You can be a 35-year-old woman, Shehzad, and you still have to adhere to this stereotype. You can be a 16-year-old woman and never adhere to this stereotype. So again, mapping that idea of youth and sexual agency onto one another so closely, I actually don't think works. Because most women above 18, all over the world, are taught to behave like babies. That idea is problematic. The idea that you're owned by a man, the idea that you don't have a mind of your own, the idea that you should not have a mind of your own is problematic. There are many people around the world. I certainly, well before I was 18, was very much someone who disliked men, and who had a very clear sense of myself. And I'm not sure, and I'm sure I would also have been aware of what I was sexually attracted to or wanted. It may have been a mistake. It could well have been a mistake, but I think I should have the right to make that mistake if I want to. This is what I'm saying to you. I feel so eager to judge, what is her name, Ivanka Trump.
Yeah.
I feel so eager to, because it's very clear what's going on, right? There must have been a huge prenuptial sign. You have to stay with me.
We're talking about Melania. Melania is the wife. Yeah, I get your confusion because Donald Trump wants to fuck both of them.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's clearly there's a prenup being signed saying if you leave me before 20 years, you'll lose all the millions that I'm otherwise going to give you. Now, I want to judge her for that, but I also don't. So I just think that people can work in different ways. And I'm just not sure that judgmentalism is the best response to it.
Since you already said that we assume we know better than our ancestors, and I keep saying the same thing in terms of psychedelics and all the knowledge that we've lost over there, but is it also just ancient and modernity? And I know that word is also misused a lot, but using it in the sense of our times. Or is it cultural? Because I mean, we know in Athens, young boys were groomed. there was cross-dressing in Shakespeare, but even when we talk about history of our own, Nautanki, all Parsi theatre companies,
Right.
all the famous actors were cross-dressers, and they were known for playing women. And
That's
people
right.
bought tickets just to go and see these men play women. And I'm not going to be foolish enough or ignorant enough to assume it was for their acting talents. No, there must have been a level of attraction because their pictures were used to sell tickets as well. So
Right.
is it culture, or is it just this difference between ancient ideas and modern ideas?
I mean, if you're, since you're a performance person as well, Shehzad, just look at the performance histories or the histories of various performance traditions in the subcontinent and in different parts of the world. Yahan pe, you don't need a man or a woman to play a male or female part, let's say in classical dance. Ki wahi banda can become a woman and become a man in the same dance without changing clothes or anything of the kind. But you'll never find, for instance, in ballet, a man playing a woman's part. And so, yes, a lot of it is our rich histories of performance. If you look, for instance, at South India, Kathakali, everything, like there are, gender is not the fundamental marker of difference. The color of your face paint could be the fundamental marker of your difference, right? So, yes, as I said, we have very live, very alive traditions that remind us that this modern idea of a man has to be a man at all times, it has not always been around us. It has not been around us for actually a long time.
I'm going to be a little anal about my own performance studies, but even this distinction between is he an actor or a dancer is a very Western idea. If you read the Natya Shastra, there is no distinction कि ये actor है, ये dancer है. हमारी history में ये तो distinction exist ही नहीं करता. Even what theater is. मैंने US में, I did my masters from Brooklyn College. वो किताब पढ़ी मैंने साउथ एशियन थिएटर पे, किसी अंग्रेज ने लिखी थी. I was like, the first time ever a woman performed in theater in the subcontinent was a white woman named Mary Fenton, and I was like, हाँ हम तो पागल हैं, हम तो हमारा तो दिमाग खराब है, हमारी तो हजारों साल की सूफी श्राइन्स परफॉर्मेंस हिस्ट्री है ही नहीं, संस्कृत थिएटर है ही नहीं. क्यों? क्योंकि उन्होंने एक बिल्डिंग बना के टिकटें नहीं बेची. वो तो सब थिएटर नहीं है ना. हम गोरे जब गए, हमने बताया कि औरतें भी स्टेज पे आ सकती हैं. You're denying our entire rich history. Then you're whitewashing the history of cross-dressing and all of...
Exactly.
And then you're eulogizing a white woman for teaching these native savages.
Exactly, because you see, the assumption that women were not performing in, among the savages before the white people came is to assume that a man is only that. You see, this goes back to our conversation earlier, which is when a man is dressing as a woman, is he a man? And the assumption which is why they, criminalized hijras, for instance, the assumption is, nahi bhai, you have to be a man, and therefore we will not allow you to be called a woman, even though you might have been performing as a woman for centuries. So, it's also, as you said earlier, how you count what gender is, right? How you count what bodies are and how they mean and how they signify. And it all sort of feeds into that certain kind of colonial narrative about who is a man and who is a woman. And you know how when the British came to India, they were horrified, and I've written about this, how they were horrified, for instance, at all these stories about how Krishna and 140,000 gopis come to orgasm at the same time. They are horrified that the Nawabs of Awadh would dress up as women and pretend to give birth during their peers' birthdays. So they were horrified by all this. And in fact, I want to say that as much as they were driven by economic greed, they were also driven by a real moral fear. Ki if we don't change all this, this is never going to be ours. Which is why the battle for Awadh was such a protracted, long drawn out, bloody, violent battle, because it was a battle for what they thought of as morality as well. And that was, that's something we forget.
British came to and came in India क्योंकि वो खुद तो उनके मुल्कों में जो जिस तरह prudish जिंदगी गुजारे थे, ना खाने को कुछ अच्छा था, खुद
वो तो अभी भी नहीं
सारे
है.
इमोशंस रिप्रेस करके कि नहीं, you have to be uptight, get everything, and then they saw people being happy and living their best lives, and उनसे बर्दाश्त नहीं हुआ कि ये लोग कैसे इस तरह रह रहे हैं, and
Yeah.
somehow we've internalized their hatred for us as self-hatred for ourselves.
I mean, exactly. Both Hinduism and Islam, and I use these words broadly because there are lots of varieties within these terms as well. But broadly speaking, the reason why Hinduism and Islam have taken such root in the subcontinent is because, unlike, let's say, Christianity, both of the Old and the New Testament, and Judaism, for instance, and several other religions, there is no injunction against, or there is no elevation against marriage. For instance, in Islam, you're encouraged to get married, and we presume, therefore, have sex. In Hinduism, the same discourse of marriage is not there from the beginning; it comes in later. But there is this understanding that everyone will have sex. And so, again, when I talk about muscle memory, this is what I mean. We have inherited centuries of thoughts that have been thought otherwise. And yes, for the last 250 years, we have been ground underfoot and made to believe that marital monogamy is the only way to go, or marital monoandry is the only way to go. But we have lived with traditions that don't say that.
I'm sure you've read about the festival of Dionysus. तो उसमें जो तीसरे दिन सैटर होता था, उस पे they did a lot of research and they talk about drinking wine. And then researchers found that the wine content they had was very minuscule, and they always wondered from the imagery and what was being said कि ये लोग क्यों नंगे पागल फिर रहे हैं, because wine doesn't do that to you. And then somebody did the research and found that no, they've mixed their wine with a psychedelic, which is why they were acting like they were. Do you feel like our cultural have also been a lot more open about drugs, quote unquote, even though a lot of things which are categorized as drugs are not really drugs, which has also helped us be a bit more open about ourselves than maybe a society that was anti-drugs, anti-psychedelics?
आप होली देखिए. I mean, the sort of idealization of bhang during Holi is huge. And it's only been in, let's say, the last year or two, some people have been saying, well, marijuana is illegal, so then how is bhang allowed? And, bhang is sold in all government outlets also here during Holi. And that sense of course, and if you read half these mythological tales, that the gods are passed out in some nasha or the other, and they forget to hear something, or they forget to listen to something. One of my favorite stories by this written down by this Rajasthani folklorist called Vijaydan Detha, who unfortunately died a few years ago, and he's written I just find it hilarious. So he writes the story about these two friends, these two men who are those, live together, sleep together, eat together, work together, everything inseparable. One is a Jat, one is a Rajput. And then the Jat goes off and gets married, and the Rajput, as his best friend, goes to his in-laws' house. And the Jat's in-laws treat the Rajput really well and say, "Aap to hamare bete ki tarah hain," blah, blah, blah. And the Jat is very happy and comes back home. Then the Rajput goes off to get married, and the Jat says, "I'll come with you." And the Rajput doesn't trust his in-laws to be nice to the Jat because they're, upper caste. And so they'll say, he says, "Oh my God, they look down on him," blah, vagara, vagara. So en route to his in-laws' house, he passes a Shiv Mandir. So he says, "Acha, ek minute, main abhi aata hu," goes inside and says, "Please, Shiv, make my in-laws treat my friend well, because if you don't, I will kill myself. I'll be that dishonored." And the story says very carefully, Shiv was lying in a stupor. He had just had his quota of bhang and even more, so he didn't even hear what this guy said and said, "Ha, whatever, chal, nikal yahan se." Rajput goes to his in-laws' house. In-laws treat the Jat badly. On the way back, Rajput goes into the temple and says, "I told you I'm going to kill myself," and cuts off his head. Jat enters the temple and says, "Arey, ye kya ho raha hai?" Sees his best friend lying there with his head cut off and said, "I cannot live without you." Takes a sword and cuts off his head. And then Shiva's consort comes along, Parvati, and says, "Bhai, don't, yaar, why do you ask my husband for all these promises? You know he's always drunk and out of his mind. He can't listen to any of it. I'll give you a chance," because meanwhile the bride had come in. "You attach your husband's head back to his body and you go." The bride gets so flustered that she attaches the friend's head to her husband's head to the friend's body. And so the moral of the story is, कि then who is the asli husband in this? कि जिसका सर है, कि जिसकी body है. So, that aside, there are millions of such stories. कि नशे में धुत हैं, कि this is happening, that is happening with people who are meant to be gods. So yes, there was a much, much greater acceptance and understanding of what it means not to always be rational, not to always be logical and set in stone. And, we all know about the sort of age of enlightenment and brought to us courtesy, the colonial endeavor, the colonial mission. And we all seem to have internalized that.
Interesting anecdote, Michael Pollan की next book जो अभी आ गई है plants पर, he says that the magic mushrooms, the psychedelics, psilocybin mushrooms, grew underneath the cow dung because essentially fungus hai. So a lot of ancient civilizations worshipped the cow and the excretion of the cow because uske niche magic mushrooms उगते थे.
Interesting.
The worship still exists, but people have forgotten कि उसके नीचे क्या था. जो actual ancient knowledge थी, जो हम पुराने लोगों को पागल समझते थे. Or even right now, if somebody, I'm assuming a lot of these liberals will see somebody worshipping a cow or the cow dung and be like, क्या जाहिल लोग हैं, इनको समझ नहीं आ रही. But you've forgotten the ancient knowledge that comes from that. And you've kept the ritual because people have done the ritual for centuries. So assume the power is in the ritual itself, whereas the power is in what the ritual represented.
Yeah.
So since you were talking about consent and you've written about desire and desire without judgment in terms of desire is desire, right? Let's not put a value judgment on it. But जब इस तरह की चीजें आती हैं, where somebody has sex with animals or somebody says no, pedophilia, and this is a stick that's used to beat the gay movement a lot with कि नहीं आप तो सारे ही pedophiles हैं, and they distance themselves a lot from it. So not to frame it like that, but what if somebody retorts with नहीं मेरा pedophilia desire है तो फिर ठीक है.
But Shahzad, वही मैं बोल रही थी ना कि where do you think these old straight men, where do you think their desire to call their wives baby comes from? कहाँ से आता? It doesn't come just because, oh, baby is an accepted term of endearment. It comes because baby is an accepted term of endearment by men for women. Because a certain kind of straight man deeply fetishizes sort of demure, fragile femininity. Childlike, childish femininity. Which is why, as you see, as women and men grow older, their physical trajectories really diverge. Women at 85 will still have black hair. Men would have lost all their hair and they don't care about it. The women will still go and get their manicures and their pedicures or, vagara, vagara. Men though would have, will grow their paunches and just sit there scratching their stomach. So this entire devaluation of the woman as being anything other than a nubile body is a very heterosexual fantasy. And this is why I said the reason it becomes a homophobic slur is because it's the heterosexuals who are projecting their own fantasy outwards. So that's why I'm sort of, as I've said before, I'm a little bit reluctant to say, oh, these people do this and these people do that. And let me be clear, Shahzad, it's not that I feel that desire isn't desire and everyone should do what they want to. I just feel that there is always a certain kind of violence, power differential, jostling for space in any imagination of desire. And the reason we don't act on that violence is because, and again, to go back to Freud, he says it's not that, he says the reason why we call civilization is because it has a greater degree of repression. If we weren't repressed, we would be going around, as Hume said, life in nature is nasty, brutish, and short. We'd be going around killing everybody, raping everybody, and all that. So we have to be repressed to a certain extent. But let's not make the mistake of thinking that desire is actually clean and sanitized. It isn't. which is why it is interesting to think about it and to think about it really carefully. Not to make it what we want it to be, but to recognize in ourselves and in others that it might run counter to what we think we want. I mean, so many times, right, with all of us, we do things that we feel we would never have wanted to do in a million years. The phrase, for instance, she's not my type, or he's not my type. Like, what does that mean? Or I'm attracted to her even though she's not my type. So we have desire names that part of ourselves that is not always rational or logical. And because it names that part of ourselves, I'm interested in it because I think it controls more of our behavior than we are willing to acknowledge.
It's also interesting. Rousseau might disagree, but Hobbes says something similar in The Leviathan, that if left to our own devices in nature, we would just kill each other. It also made me think of the idea that if you go on a porn site, of course, 18, the fetish of I just turned 18 is big. But recently I've noticed, not that I go to a lot of them, it's just for research, step sister, stepmother, stepfather, that category has just blown up. And I don't know if it's recent or not, but I see it everywhere there. So there must be an incestuous desire that they're catering to.
That's interesting. Yeah. I had no idea. I do know, though, the one category that has gone through the roof in terms of
Violence.
porn watchers. No, porn watchers is women. The number of women visiting porn sites now is through the roof. And I think that's great. And I hope that sort of leads to really good consequences. But I think you're right in your reading of the stepfather, stepmother, stepsister business. I think there's a deep attraction that can then be diverted at the end and made okay. There's sort of the taboo, and Freud again talks about the taboo, the incest taboo, and this, that, and the other. There's a great taboo on incest, but again, incest is one of those words that I have a problem with, because what counts as incest in, say, California is not what counts as incest in Calcutta. So, in both Pakistan and India, and certainly in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal, many communities think it is not just advisable, but imperative for you to marry your first cousin. I come from such a community. You might well come from such a community as well. We are going to be called incestuous by anybody sitting in California. So incest is one of those terms that's actually much more flexible than we think of it as being. And again, it's one of those sort of judgmental terms, but it varies from place to place.
Alabama also, not to just place all the judgments on us. उनके भी hillbilly towns हैं. ये किसी ने रिव्यू लिखा था कि हैदर में शाहिद कपूर और तब्बू का जो relationship made them uncomfortable, and I was like, have you not read Hamlet?
If you didn't, the answer is no, Shehzad. सवाल ही क्यों पूछ रहे हैं आप?
But I thought Heather was a very decent adaptation of the idea of
very.
Denmark is Hamlet, so turning that into Kashmir is Heather. I thought it was quite a brilliant articulation of that idea.
Very. I really like that film. I like all of Vishal Bharadwaj's Shakespeare films. I think he does it very smartly. And yeah, Heather was very moving, very strong.
And also really smart to use Fez's words, because he comes from that Sufi history as well. So what Sufis talk about in terms of the beloved, I think Fez transposes that on the nation a lot. So even when he says Hum ke thehre ajnabi, he's talking about Bangladesh and Pakistan. So that idea of the beloved being the country, I think was used quite expertly by Vishal Bharadwaj. Should email him and be like, please sir, Heather discuss karte.
Yeah, I think you froze for a few seconds in the middle for me, Shehzad, but I think it was my fault. But still, I got the gist of what you were saying at the end.
So essentially, I think आपने जो infantilization की बात की थी, you've also written about the love jihad वाला जो case था. I forgot the case's name, but here is a woman who's in her 20s, and that desire to infantilize a woman's agency is so great that they still say नहीं, ये तो consent नहीं कर सकती, क्योंकि she's still in her 20s, तो इसका तो दिमाग अब तक वही है.
Exactly. I mean, the case you're referring to is the Hadiya case in Kerala, but there are thousands of such cases. The great state of Uttar Pradesh has recently passed and then 4 other states after it have recently passed a so-called love jihad bill, which is anti-conversion on the pretext of marriage, but it is very extensive and very Islamophobic and very much targeting Muslims. But yes, the fundamental assumption there is women do not know their desires. So that cannot even be taken into consideration. If a Hindu woman says she wants to marry a Muslim man, then sar phir gaya uska. That something has happened to her. And so the state will take over. There is a legal provision called parens patriae, where the state will act as the father. And that's exactly what happens in these cases of love jihad. Woman above 18 makes no difference. Consensual makes no difference. Even family approval makes no difference. There is going to be violence enacted on that union.
ये भी ब्रिटिश लेगेसी है ना कि ये मुस्लिम है और ये हिंदू है. I think we might even accept कि ब्रिटिश ने हमें सेक्सुअल और जेंडर फ्लूइडिटी के खिलाफ हमारे अंदर इनग्रेन किया है, but I think we might even find it harder to accept that even our religious identities were less created by scriptures and more created by the British for us.
Without doubt, Shehzad. I mean, and this kind of formulation, of course, will get resistance from both ends of the spectrum, but without doubt. And it had everything to do with their legal code. So when Macaulay is tasked with the idea of setting up laws for India, right? Because remember, they were horrified by how many different laws there were. What they inherited was the Mughal administrative structure, which actually, yes, they had some laws that were sort of religion specific, but it was more sort of culture specific. So if you were Hindus from a particular area or if you're Muslims from a particular area, phir ye aapke saath chalega, but not otherwise. So Muslim administrative laws were really not that premised on religious difference. And the British were horrified because, of course, for them, the idea of a heathen or intermarrying or whatever was anathema. And of course, you had famously Mughal emperors, Akbar being the most famous of all, not allowing religion to be a bar to who he had his most intimate relationships with, who he had his most intimate political relationships with as well. And so the British are tasked with the idea of, or with the job of coming up with the law for India. And they decide it has to be along religious lines, A, and B, even more damaging, they decide it has to be along certain scriptural lines. So for Hindu law, they picked the most conservative, the most reactionary, the most rigid text, which is the Manusmriti, which is what lays down the caste order and the caste hierarchy in horrific detail and horrendous detail. For the Muslims, rather than saying ki all these flexible interpretations, all these systems of Sharia, which were taken into account, wo kuch nahi, we are going to strictly abide by the Quran. And similarly with the Christians, whatever, Jains, Buddhists, everybody. Ever since then, you have to count as a Muslim or a Hindu to be legally recognized in India. We're talking about the 1870s. Even now, and it's some staggering figure, at the turn of the last century, meaning 1911, even as late as that, there were 2 lakh people in Gujarat that identified themselves as Muslim Hindus. Every single Sufi and Bhakti poet we know refers to Allah, Ram, Krishna across the board. Every Sufi poet will have at least 1 or 2 poems where he describes himself as a cowherd, i.e. as Krishna. Bulle Shah, of course, is only the most famous, but so is someone like Khusro that says, there is no Turk and there is no Hindu. We are all one. That kind of syncretic lifestyle, which is not you and I are the same, but that you and I can live side by side happily. That is the vision that the British destroyed legally, socially, religiously, sexually. And they did it with such sinister and cynical fear in their hearts. They did it by spreading hatred. To my mind, what's happening in our countries now is a repeat of what the British did 250 years ago.
100%. I think, I'm not sure if Benedict Anderson is still alive, but if he is, he needs to write and imagine communities and take that to imagine identities. It's not just community, but even your singular identity, every single identity is just imagined. I'm not sure if we can take his idea to be articulated as such, but that's what's on my mind right now. Do you?
I mean, and just sort of, sorry, just one thing, Shahzad, just if you imagine there are, the number varies, but people say anywhere between 30,000 to 300,000 deities in the pantheon of Hinduism. Can you really call all these people by one name, which is Hindu? I mean, and a lot of scholars have done a lot of research on this. The very term Hindu becomes an administrative convenience. You see why I'm sort of allergic to administrative convenience a little bit? Because it's always in the service of whitewashing, universalizing, reduction of multiplicity to singularity. And then if we say, bhai, no, singularity is what's most important, to go back to the sort of by erasure and stuff that you were talking about, that to me is ironic, because it's actually the opposite of that. To say that we are all in this together, that we can build solidarity, that to me is what is most politically pressing and needed.
If I remember correctly, Manan, Loss of Hindustan, I think he argues that Hindu ka to etymology yahi thi, the people of the Indus. It was not a religion. It comes from Indus, Hindu to Hindu. So it's just people who live by the Indus.
Exactly. And that's, the Persianized version of the Greek name. So it's people living by the Indus. It is a geographical term, which is why it was called Hindustan. It had nothing to do with Hindus.
So do you also face this backlash? So for instance, I just did a podcast, we're talking about Islamic history as well. But on the flip side, I'm also aware of the social reality where our prime minister might want everybody to see Ertugrul, to think of themselves as these Islamic heroes, and that to weaponize that reassertion of Islam as anti the other. You're Muslim, there's Islamophobia outside. Let's get together in this nationalistic zeal and then maybe misuse that to create the Taliban or support the Taliban. And in India, you see a similar Hindutva project. So do you feel like the things that we're talking about, which 100% are true, but they come up against that reality where people might want to misuse that and turn it into a nationalist project? And how do we maybe even combat that in our conversations?
Well, Shahzad, you know very well, I'm sure from your time in Brooklyn, is that the minute Indians and Pakistanis step outside India and Pakistan, they are the best of friends. Among my closest friends when I was in the US were Pakistanis, without doubt, and vice versa, clearly. And the reason they were my close friends and are my close friends is not, it's precisely because we could remind ourselves again of everything that our states had asked us to forget. And this is why I have deep faith in people. I don't have faith in mobs or crowds, but I have deep faith in people. And I have deep faith in multiplicity, which is why for me, the most peculiar thing is a belief in singularity, because it goes against every single minute of every single day of our lives. We are not singular, we are multiple. And so, yes, you can weaponize what you called earlier victimhood. But what's interesting here is that victimhood does not necessarily belong only to the numerical minority. So any project of violence, any project of racial, ethnic, religious, sexual superiority, in fact, is much more dangerous when it is articulated by a numerical majority. As is the case with India today, as was the case with the Third Reich in Germany. When people in a majority, as is the case, for instance, with heterosexual men around the world, where they say, we are under attack because of those people out there. And, Barbara Johnson, who used to be this professor of English at Harvard, once famously said that the surest sign of power is to narrate yourself as powerless. And that is exactly what's happening, certainly politically here, is that on the one hand, you claim a brute numerical majority of 86%. On the other hand, you say we're being undermined and sold down the river every single day. Now, those two statements do not meet. And this is again where the psyche comes in, right? This is where it's really interesting. So for instance, somebody said, How come majoritarian violent movements aren't happy once they win their victories, right? So for instance, Trump, once he wins certain victories for white men, or the Hindutva project wins certain victories for Hindutva, how come they aren't happy? And as someone else, actually a psychoanalyst said, because they are attached to anger and being unhappy. That there is absolutely nothing that can make them happy. In fact, being happy will make them most unhappy because that's not what they want. So we are mistaken when we think that this has anything to do with religion, that it has anything to do with sexuality or gender. It has everything to do with a sense of being beleaguered. It has everything to do with a certain aggressive violence that you disown in yourself and project outward and say, I am the victim of that violence. You know, it's like an older sibling and a younger sibling, right? I don't know if you are older or younger, Shehzad.
What do you
But
think?
the older,
Psychoanalyzing. What do you think? Psychoanalysis. Kya hu
you
main?
you are interesting. I would say you're middle.
Just because I feel abandoned and I'm depressed, just because I get no love in life, you assume I'm the middle child. I'm the youngest, actually.
You're the youngest. That was going to be my second choice in my defense. But anyway,
The
the idea of
the choices then.
the second is also important. So you're devaluing the middle. But it's like the older sibling beating the younger sibling and then saying, she hit me, which we see in every household around the world. What is the psychology of that? That's what I find fascinating.
Since we talked about this a while back, but मेरे एक बहुत से दोस्त हैं, Saim Sadiq, he would love to hear this. You also said that Dostana is a better representation of the culture than a show like Made in Heaven or Kapoor and Sons. I found that idea fascinating. So Saim would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I miss a certain kind of Bollywood, aesthetic and ethic. And the Bollywood that I'm talking about, I think of which Dostana is also an example, is a certain kind of what my friend Gil Harris calls a masala culture. And a masala culture is exactly what we've been talking about, Shehzad, ki not that everything is mixed so that nothing can be tasted, but that साथ मिले हुए हैं बहुत सारी चीजें. So a masala culture, for instance, in a certain genre of Bollywood movie, you would never have all the characters belonging to the same religion or same region or speaking the same language or the same sexual orientation. कभी नहीं होता था. There would always be some chacha or taya or khala or bua or somebody who comes from elsewhere, who comes from South India, or who is a Christian, or who is a Hindu, or who is a Muslim, whatever it is. Bollywood cinema, to my mind, and we like to look down upon it and say, kya ye sab naach gana vagera vagera. Bollywood cinema, to my mind, perfectly showcases, or much of it perfectly showcases, a certain kind of syncretic tradition that I think is the richest part of our cultural histories. Shows like Made in Heaven, which, you know, to a great extent I enjoyed. I am deeply grateful for OTT shows because actually in many ways they are pushing the envelope in ways that Bollywood certainly cannot right now. But the problem with Made in Heaven, and this goes back to your very first question, Shehzad, is that it deals in a language of LGBTQI+. Now, Amitabh Bachchan and Shashi Kapoor or Devanand or Rajesh Khanna did not know what LGBTQIA+ was. But they still knew कि ये दोस्ती का एक बॉन्ड होता है जो मुझे नहीं पता क्या है लेकिन है. To my mind, that is much more rooted, long-lasting, abiding than this, oh, why don't you come out as gay? And that being the entire sort of rah-rah moment that we all cheer.
And even the question of representation, जिसने पाकिस्तान की एक सिंगर है, folk तो नहीं है, अब तो popular ही है actually, Nasibo Lal, or maybe Madonna. These are queer icons, not because of their identity, but for what they represent for the queer culture.
Well, and one classic example I give actually all my, people who sort of say, well, why you say this, people who talk about representation, right? And that's a huge argument and I can understand parts of it. But people who say, I want to see people like me in order to feel validated. I keep saying many of my gay male friends who grew up in the 70s in India realized they were gay by watching Helen on screen. doing her vamp.
Ab-
Exactly. Doing her vamp dances, you know? So when you're talking about representation, it's actually a much more complicated phenomenon than just seeing myself on screen or people like me or whatever that is. In fact, representation allows us to expand the scope of what we think we look like or who we think we are. Ki bhai, if I am identifying with that person who looks nothing like me, then masla to hai kuch.
Zabardast. I think maybe these are also questions of the movement at large. Ke a lot of times हम import कर लेते हैं conversations that are happening in America,
Right.
and we try to superimpose them on things which round holes or square pegs वाली बात है, sort of. And we
I
need.
have to give you an example. I don't know if you are at all obsessed with this, but I'm currently obsessed with this Korean drama called, with a horrible title called Crash Landing on You, Netflix pe hai. And the reason I love it, I'm only about halfway through, but the reason I love it is because this was the Bollywood cinema that I love. The scenario is that there's an heiress from South Korea, extremely rich industrialist, who has a paragliding accident and lands in North Korea. And the whole serial is about longing between two nations, longing between two people, longing for what you have been estranged from. And that idea of longing so infuses a certain kind of Bollywood ethic where not only did a lot of Pakistani singers, actors, screenwriters, poets find their, calling, but until 5 years ago was also populated by Pakistani backstage artists, background singers, and actors too. And so Bollywood for me has always been a space until recently of that kind of imagination, right? Let's imagine otherwise. And for me, that's the power of the arts. And so, Crash Landing on You is a very, very typical K-drama, Korean drama, but it is infused with this kind of longing that I find extremely seductive.
I'm not sure
So
if
if
you're.
you want a recommendation on Netflix, wo aap jaake dekhein.
I'm not sure if you're a fan of musicals as well, but I love musicals. And ये जो
That
हमारे
too.
एक आजकल बन गया है कि realism ही अच्छा है. I love a movie like Gangs of Wasseypur. I love Lunchbox. I love these movies. But I also like a Kinky Boots. But I also love Hamilton. Like when I read about Hamilton, I was like, yaar, ye kya hai? American forefathers are going to rap. I go in, within 15 minutes, I forget every single thing. I'm just watching a great piece of art.
Exactly, which is why Bollywood and Nach Gana is so powerful. And so when people sort of say, what is a stupid thing, song and dance sequences, we have to be realistic and have these sort of, deeply depressed realistic films. You're losing out so much. Your Nach and Gana is that space of possibility, is that space of exploration of otherness, which I think is so important for us.
And it's cultural. So like, not to say कि Shakespeare lowbrow नहीं था, ये भी जो लोग highbrow उसको protect करते हैं, लोग हंटिंग कर रहे होते थे, sex jokes हैं उसके अंदर. A lot of times people cut out the comedy scenes, but even something as lowbrow as there that was cultural, when it gets imported into Parsi theatre companies through Aga Hashar Kashmiri, it gets infused even more with that poetic element, even more. And that's the beauty of it. And आपने भी ये बात की हुई है कि originality पे बड़ा focus होता है. Would anybody dare say Aga Hashar Kashmiri was not original?
Exactly.
Can anybody dare say that?
Would anyone dare say Shakespeare was not original? And he was the least original person in the world.
Romulus and Julius कुछ story थी जो Romeo and Juliet. It was a Roman poem, I think.
The whole point of Romeo and Juliet is, the whole point of a lot of Shakespeare's poetry, a lot of English Renaissance poetry, is that it actually comes straight from the ghazal, the form of the ghazal that went west through Spain, informed the French troubadours, who then informed an Italian poet like Petrarch, who then comes to England directly. So these connections actually are extremely Eastern. And we just don't make those connections because we say Shakespeare's poetry has nothing to do with the Sufi ghazal. And in fact, they are very closely intertwined, which is why Romeo and Juliet, I think, people in India and Pakistan love Romeo and Juliet, Shireen Farhad, Laila Majnu over and over again, because these are the same stories.
Yeah.
They're the stories that have circulated over and over again. They're stories of our togetherness, even if they're stories about two lovers being pushed apart.
ये थिएटर एकेडमिक को पाकिस्तान में हार्ट अटैक आ जाता है जब मैं ये बात करता हूँ, बट उमर शरीफ डज दीज क्रैश स्टेज शोज and I keep saying they're Shakespearean and people are like, get out of our room. But the Parsi theatre companies का जो episodic structure है, that came to Lahore and that's where stage shows come from. So yes, even things like ये Mujra is a bastardization form. No, not really.
Yeah.
Mujra is the art form. It actually has its roots in Kathak. It actually has its roots in courtesan culture. It's just हमें अपनी चीजें बुरी लगती हैं. आप burlesque देखेंगे आपको खूबसूरत लगेगा, मुजरा देखेंगे आपको बुरा लगेगा.
But it's because the British suddenly said, you're not going to be called courtesans, you're going to be called prostitutes. And so then suddenly you have that overnight shift in terminology and frame. And so they move, courtesans move from being the repositories of culture, from being the people who you would go to learn from, to being demeaned as नाचने गाने वाली औरतें.
जो वो थोड़ा बहुत कल्चर भी रह गया था, ज़ियाउल हक ने वो बर्बाद कर दिया. Similarly, Hira Mandi, as it pejoratively known, but Shahi Mohalla was the repository of arts and culture in Pakistan. Even the word actually Kanjar, which is used pejoratively, it's a family name. It's a name of उनके surnames है, Mahmood Kanjar, Amjad Kanjar. हम उसको pejoratively लेते हैं. मैं when I was performing theatre in Lahore, we used to very proudly say कैसा ते हैं कंजरा. We proudly own that identity. It's a badge of honor if you call me a Kanjar. Thank you so much. I've taken a lot of your time. I got a bunch of these questions. मुझे खुद ये story नहीं पता. But some professor got kicked out of Ashoka University and they're like, what about freedom of speech? So I don't know. Pratap, Bhanu, Mehta.
So what is the question?
Why did he get kicked out? What about freedom of speech? Consider his removal.
Asha, that is the question. Frankly, I don't know. We don't know. Pratap resigned. He said in his official resignation letter that he was not pressured. None of us believe that. We think there was a great deal of political pressure and that the university buckled to political pressure. But we have no proof, we have no evidence, and we have Pratap who is not speaking. So it was a big blow. It continues to be a big blow. I think it's horrific that the freedoms, the spaces that we had carved out for ourselves very painfully over the years in India seem to be shrinking so rapidly that you blink and another space disappears. So far, we're trying to hold the line at Ashoka, but one never knows when we'll be forced to retreat.
Yeah, apparently Ashoka gets a lot of backlash as well. A lot of people were had weird ideas about what the university is. आप far right क्यों नहीं बुलाते हैं? Neoliberal लोगों को बुलाते रहते हैं, even though you're not even neoliberal.
Up far right, you were asked.
Yeah. I keep getting asked कि क्यों आप सिर्फ अपने टाइप के लोगों को बुलाते हैं. मैं किसको बुलाऊं?
अच्छा, हाँ.
किसको बुलाऊं? अपने टाइप लोगों से तो मजा आता है बात करने का.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Shahzad. You have a very, very lively intelligence, and it's just sort of fascinating to be in conversation with.
I am the Shakespeare. I think of myself as the Shakespearean fool. कि अगर किसी को कुछ बुरा भला कहना है तो मैं ही कह सकता हूँ. It's only the fool that can tell the emperor that he has no clothes. So if I have to criticize our government and our structures, मुझे ये comedian का रूप धारना पड़ता है. Otherwise, we are not like wontons to gods with flies.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that doesn't, many people are not protected even by that disguise. So
don't give them ideas. I don't want to be the Munawwar Farooqi of Pakistan. And Taliban just killed a comedian. It's just a tragedy. And I know every single person who dies is a tragedy. But when you find a point of connection like this, that they killed a comedian, it just tends to hurt more.
Well, and also when you know the reason why they would have. You see, that's what I always say about fascism is it's not stupid. It knows who to target. And it will always target performers, intellectuals, scholars, non-governmental spaces, always. Because that's where the pressure lies. There's the pressure point and they'll just push against that. So that's awful.
I know we talked about it slightly before we started, but there's been a real rise, or at least in the reporting of violence against women recently in Pakistan. A lot of people were wondering if there is a root to that violence. Do you have any ideas? I mean, there can obviously not be a singular root. But why
Yeah.
do you see we see a systematic, we're calling it femicide now in Pakistan, but do you see this systematic violence against women in both India and Pakistan?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think it's only India and Pakistan, to be fair. I think it is around the world. I mean, the answer is on one hand so clear, and on the other hand, it's so entrenched that I don't know if we'll ever get out of it. I mean, the answer is called, for lack of a better word, patriarchy. And we have to remember that patriarchy is not practiced by men only. If it was practiced only by men, I think women would be far better off. But it's practiced by a lot of women, as you know, with all these Ekta Kapoor Saas Bahu serials, for instance, as a template. Women police other women very, very effectively and cruelly. And unless women are able to find solidarity among ourselves and sort of say no more patriarchal bullshit, women are never going to be safe. And we are always going to be at the receiving end of this kind of hatred and violence because no one is standing up to say no. You see, for instance, the British would never have conquered India if the Indians did not join them. You can't have just sort of one constituency overwhelming another. It's when there are infiltrators from that into this that you can overcome. So if women stop and say we are no longer going to be patriarchal lackeys, that's our only hope. Our only hope. Which is why
As
I'm much more interested in women than in men. Like I feel men, I'm sorry to say, are a lost cause. For me, I think women should be learned to, or should be taught to realize that it's not in their best interest to police other women.
I think that's as good as words as any to end this. That's great advice for everybody else. It was an absolute honor and a privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much for this.
Likewise, thank you so much and see you soon.
See you. Thank you everybody listening. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.